Co-housing. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I think that the future co-housing projects of BC are, many of them are in the room. I mean, I know that many of them are in the room because you know, if you look at the different tables about, you will see not only nascent projects, but representatives from projects that have been up and running for over 10 years now. And certainly, thank you, appreciate that. Certainly, if you've ever walked onto a co-housing community, it's palpable that it's a little different than too many neighborhoods, unfortunately. Too many neighborhoods where people don't know each other, for example. And consequently, the folks who started co-housing in Europe, in Denmark in 1972, basically said, you know, we're not doing anything new. We're just trying to create what used to happen much more naturally than it occurs today. I mean, as it occurs today, neighborhoods are more or less real estate too often, and not much more than real estate. The giving places that we might romanticize or might have actually occurred on occasion, but we know that can happen. As Daryl mentioned, I learned about co-housing when I was going to school in Denmark. I think he mentioned that, but anyway, I was going to school in Denmark in 1980 at the University of Copenhagen, and it wasn't, you know, a class conversation, even though I was going to architecture school. It was walking by this neighborhood day after day and noticing that people are sitting on the common terrace, like here. People are sitting at a common gathering picnic table. People are stopping on the pathways, talking to each other. Meanwhile, I would also walk by a condominium, single-family houses, apartments, and nobody was, I never saw anybody talking to each other in those developments. So one day I stopped and I asked them, you know, what's going on here? Why is it, you know, why do I see so much activity between the houses here where I don't see it anywhere else? And this woman said, well, you know, have a seat, and started to explain to me that her and her husband had decided that they wanted to raise their family in a high-functioning neighborhood. And it was important to them, it was an important component to their quality of life, and they didn't want to take it for granted, and they didn't want to take chances. In fact, I came to the conclusion that it was in fact a very conservative approach to, you know, sometimes people think of it as, you know, progressive or whatever, but I came to the conclusion, in fact, it's quite conservative, the notion that I want to have a high-functioning neighborhood, that I want to live in a high-functioning neighborhood where people know each other, care about each other, support each other through the trials and tribulations of life or the joys of life, etc. So anyway, let me just move along here. Go ahead, if you wouldn't mind. You know, as Daryl mentioned, co-housing starts with a group of people, basically. That's part and parcel. Even though I've designed about 50 co-housing communities now, I wouldn't do it without a group of people. I don't believe that I can actually come up with a solution that's better than what they can come up with. And I'm always amazed every single time, including here in Vancouver or here in Chilliwack, for example, sitting down with a group of folks who had never designed a house, much less a whole neighborhood previously, except somehow managed to come up with a place that made so much more sense than anything, you know, that you would normally see, whether it's a regular developer or an architect who has designed 50 co-housing communities. Somehow getting into their values, understanding their values, and drawing them out. It turns out everybody's got a little bit of architect in them. Some people have a lot of architect in them. And of course they get to be lively conversations. And you know, one of the biggest myths about co-housing is, oh, it must take so much time. Well, it's amazing how, like in this case, we came up with this neighborhood design in 4 days. And, you know, and basically when you get into a role, and it's fairly facilitated. I mean, basically all the rocks are overturned, and the possibilities are considered, and you know, people come up with intelligent designs. Go ahead. And here's the one I live in Northern California, near Lake Tahoe, 34 houses. Again, we actually co-designed this project with 25 households from the beginning. And from the beginning, the priorities were things like people-friendly, and child-friendly, and elderly-friendly, and family-friendly, and safe, and, you know, and car-free, for example. You know, never have I actually sat down with a group of households and they've asked for, you know, garages along a road. Not once, in 50 occasions of designing co-housing communities have they said, you know, I want to see a bunch of garage doors as I drive down the road, and maybe I could wave at them as I'm passing by. But you know, they talk more about, you know, a place where it's easy to run into your neighbor. It's easy to not, you know, to like, you know, I live here and sometimes I'm busy and I just walk on. But the point is that when you walk into a co-housing community, you always feel like you have a choice between as much privacy as you want and as much community as you want. Whereas too many neighborhoods feel like you have a choice between as much privacy as you want or as much privacy as you want. And in fact, no choice at all. So those are the kinds of people that come to the table, people who actually want to broaden their choices in their neighborhood and their lives by virtue of you know, being able to run into their neighbors. Even in a very dense situation like this one here in Oakland, you know, centralizing the circulation, for example, the pedestrian circulation, making it easy to bump into your neighbors on your way home. Go ahead, if you wouldn't mind. Common facilities is another key ingredient. So not only is it, you know, one of the key ingredients of co-housing is that the future residents are involved from the beginning, that it's designed to facilitate a sense of community over time. And third, that extensive common facilities. Where I live, we have dinner in the common house available about 6 nights a week, usually about 6 nights a week. And, you know, Kate and I participate 1 or 2 or 3 times a week as we choose. But it is available there. Go ahead. This happens to be Fresno Co-Housing, another brand new project just finished in California. Go ahead. This is Cotati, which is 50 miles north of San Francisco. Interestingly enough, in 2004, this 30-unit development won Neighborhood of the Year in the U.S. And it's so interesting to me that a group of school teachers, basically, you know, they won the best design in the U.S. that year, 2004, for Neighborhood of the Year. But it makes sense, again, because you're sitting back, you step back, and you find out what their real lives are really about. What are their values? What are their needs? What are their wants? And reflecting those pretty directly. Go ahead. And then the fourth component that's very consistent with co-housing is that the future residents completely manage the co-housing community. You know, it's more or less a strata, typically. And the big difference is that at a typical strata of 34 units, for example, maybe 5 or 7 people would be on the board, but where I live, every adult's on the board. So basically, you know, and decisions are made by virtue of consensus. So, you know, people would think, oh, doesn't that bog things down? Well, we have a meeting once a month, about 2.5 hours. That's about all we have the patience for. And I've decided that co-housers, one of the reasons I like living in the co-housing that I live in is they don't like meetings. You know, they come wearing their kayak clothes and their bicycle clothes, and they're ready to get out of there as fast as possible. But they come to make decisions, because we do make decisions together. But they tend to be better decisions than we would have made on our own. We have a few acres, so we have a bunch of trees, and it's always like, cut the tree down, don't cut the tree down. Have to have that conversation, and in 10 minutes we'll make generally speaking, a better decision than I would have made on my own. You know, like, let's start the chainsaws at 9 instead of 7:30, for example. You know, other small details like that. Anyway, go ahead if you wouldn't mind. This happens to be that Cotati photograph again, and you know, interestingly enough, to save money, that particular group decided to do all of their own landscaping, for example, very unorthodox in a regular neighborhood, or especially a strata where you would have to have all the landscaping in before you moved in. And they decided to do it all themselves, much to the chagrin of the future of the neighbors around their project, who were afraid that they would never get around to it. Go ahead, Lauren. But then 2 years later, they had 77 fruit trees. This happens to be their 2nd year anniversary. And the neighbors who were so concerned about the landscaping are all of Judy there in the front is the only resident, and the others are all there on a tour. They had to limit the tours to Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock because there were so many you know, of the neighbors walking about and checking out their landscaping. So they now have tours. Go ahead. And it's very lush, like ours happens to be as well. Again, we did 100% of our own landscaping, and it was fun. Go ahead. That's the one back at Cotati. Go ahead. You know, generally speaking, the folks who get involved with co-housing often are young families. I mean, co-housing started in Denmark as a as a way of making an extremely family-friendly setting, if you will. In fact, one of my neighbors who's been living in the co-housing now for the last 2 years said that previous to moving into co-housing, he has 4 children. He said he organized 2 to 4 play dates a weekend. 2 to 4 play dates that he had to drive his kids to, and since he's lived in co-housing for 2 years, he hasn't planned one single play date. Katie and I, we were motivated to only have 1 child, and our child turned out to be extremely social. So it would have been nothing less than abusive at some basic level to have only had 1 child. And yet she has 37 brothers and sisters, if you will, or cousins anyway, who live in the neighborhood, and it makes it easy for us, made it easy for us to have 1 kid. So chasing kids, and go ahead, Lauren, and being chased by kids are, you know, part and parcel to, you know, typical intergenerational co-housing. Go ahead. But then there's the other side of it, which is, you know, I often hear in the planning of a new project, adults saying, you know, I want to make a place where adults can be adults and kids can be kids. For example, if this was a co-housing, you know, the kids' room would be down the hall just a little bit more, typically. So that adults could be adults and kids could be kids, and there's no conflict there. So in this case, so adults could be, you know, after dinner could sit and have a cup of coffee or whatever, and then go ahead, and the kids can be kids, you know. And so again, not just reflecting the needs, wants, and desires of the adults themselves, but also the kids, basically. You know, you always hear, you know, in the context of planning a project, let's not create a no environment. Let's create a very affirming environment. But that's only possible if the kids are adequately accommodated for. Go ahead. You know, this whole thing about community, it's a bit of a nebulous term. What does it mean exactly? And we all talk about it as if it's important, and yet we can't necessarily put our finger on it and can't quantify its importance in a viable society one way or the other. Unfortunately, I mean, it's not like engineering where you can quantify everything. But, and what difference does it make anyway? You know, it's interesting because this child here in a wheelchair, who happens to be a quadriplegic, because he's a quadriplegic, he was a party to a 100-child-wide study in the US. And it turns out there were only 2 of those quadriplegic children who had more interaction with people not paid to be with him than people who were paid to be with him. 98 of those kids had more interaction with people who were paid to be with them. Physical therapist, doctor, teacher, dentist, eyeglasses, you name it, wheelchair mechanic, etc. The other one lives in a co-op in Manhattan. Before moving into co-housing, Christian had about 3 hours of peer interaction a week. Living in co-housing, he has 23 hours of peer interaction a week. But you didn't need the studies to figure that out. Basically, you walked on site and you saw whatever the kids were doing, whether they were playing tag or football or whatever they were doing. Christian was just included. There was no question about it. It was a natural extension of you know, their neighborhood, basically, that Christian would be included. Go ahead to the next slide if we're done. And you couldn't, and previous to that, Christian lived in this neighborhood, actually, which happened to be just down the street from that neighborhood, the new co-housing community, and consequently I'd walk down here every once in a while, just sort of like trying to imagine what's happening here. And yet, you know, we build about 150,000 houses a year in California, and that's what too many of them look like, actually. And I happened to run into a neighbor here once, and I said, I'm just curious, how long does it take to get to know your neighbor in this neighborhood? And she said, well, usually about 5 years, and by that time they've moved. And you know, I was showing this slide in Germany a couple years ago, and a German guy said, you know, hey Chuck, where's the front door? Yeah. And I said, well, you know, you don't really need one. You just genie up the garage door, and you pull your car in the garage, and you pop your dinner in the microwave, and you pop your movie in the VCR, and that's living. You know, that is living at some level, basically. Interestingly enough, though, what I really find interesting is the same developer who did this project. Go back one slide, if you would. Did this project. The same exact developer. The only difference is, in this case, we had 26 households from day one who said, this is the priorities for a neighborhood for us. And so, actually considerably less resources. This happened to be a very affordable co-housing community. And then these, go ahead to the next one, this much more wasteful setting in this case. I mean, at some level, lots of people get involved with co-housing for lots of different reasons. Usually it starts off with, things like lifestyle advantages to, having kids be able to run out the front door and play with other kids, for example. And then it doesn't take long in the conversation before people start bringing up, wouldn't it be more energy efficient? Wouldn't it be more sustainable if we did this, sustainably grown lumber, solar panels on the roof, one thing or another? And and it usually does go that way, no doubt about it. It's one of the things I like about my job the most, of course. But certainly if we wanted to create a more global warming friendly environment, we couldn't do better than this. Spread these houses equidistant across the landscape, and make them as energy. I don't care what kind of trappings you put on this setting, whether it's the roads that it takes to get onto, to get from one house to another, or the fact that it's surrounded by, cold weather. There's lots of things that, in my mind, doesn't make it sustainable. Not to mention all the social issues. I mean, I just read the other day that for the first time in the U.S., in the U.S. more women above 18-year-olds live without a husband than live with a husband. First time in American history. The single-person households in the U.S. is 27%. Somebody just told me tonight it's 31% in Canada. That leads to a lot of in my opinion, pathologies, frankly, and it doesn't allow the same kind of choices that you have if you live in a functioning neighborhood. So, go ahead. Whether it's a glass-covered street like we're actually trying to do in Vancouver, whether we pull it off or not, I'm not sure. But this happens to be in Denmark, where the spring and fall for sure. It makes it nicer to have all the goals set out to accomplish under that setting. Go ahead. For those of you who are familiar with Bill McKibben, and south of the border, he's the guy, combating global warming more than anybody else. I mean, he's just the champion of trying to come up with alternatives to global warming. And he wrote recently that what impressed him most about visiting co-housing was not all the energy conservation that's going on, and it is significant, but the energy creation that happens there. And certainly that's my experience too. A group of people get together and start to talk about the issues of the day. It doesn't take long before they figure out a way to solve the issues of the day, especially because they have the one main powerful tool of being able to cooperate with each other. As soon as you can start to cooperate with 30, 40 households, you can do amazing stuff. I mean, what we do in our community, for example, I mean, it's quite a long list. We have one lawnmower for 34 households. And it just becomes obvious that all these things would just fall into place in ways that are extremely complicated outside of a setting where cooperation is the norm versus the exception. When cooperation becomes the norm, then it's more or less a watershed in terms of how easy it is to live lighter on the planet, for example. Go ahead. Whether it's an urban co-housing, Kate and I lived here this happens to be just as we were finishing construction of a 12-unit co-housing community in the San Francisco Bay Area. Go ahead. Fairly urban in that particular case. Go ahead. And it happened to be an adaptive reuse. So this happens to be a type of co-housing that we're seeing more and more of, where a group actually buys an old building and then we turn it into a new co-housing community. Go ahead. So it's actually not necessarily an obvious archetype necessarily, but it is a process by where the future residents play a role. The key archetypical piece of it, however, is that on the one hand, just to fill out the explanation a little bit, is on the one hand people do have their own private houses, and on the other hand they have common facilities to supplement those private houses. And in this one rendition back to Katati, they ended up doing a 10,000 square foot commercial in addition to the 30 units of co-housing as well. Go ahead. That project from the air, again, when it was first constructed. Go ahead. What co-housing does to the larger neighborhood, it's interesting. I hope somebody does this study sometime. We have for example, we have a New Year's Eve party in the co-housing community I live in, and we're about 100 of our neighbors join the 100 residents who live there. And I swear that that's the only time that they speak to each other through the whole year. In our neighborhood, these people that for the first time, because we have this common house, for example, because we have this party, for example. And in fact, in this particular photo, 2 of these 4 residents live in the co-housing and 2 of them are neighbors. But there's something about what co-housing does to the neighborhood. Basically, it models cooperation, for example, and people start to see it as a watershed in terms of what can happen in a larger neighborhood. Go ahead. Who does what? Well, I have to cook in the co-housing community that I live in every 5 or 6 weeks. That's one of the requirements where I live. You have to cook dinner. But it turns out not to be a big deal. You're cooking with 2 or 3 other people, and it turns out to be fun. Go ahead. This happens to be a 16-unit project we finished in Boulder, Colorado recently, and I showed it because it has some similarities to the project that we're working on in Vancouver. Go ahead, if you would. In this particular case, what I find so interesting about this project is that we spent a couple days talking about the private houses, people's future houses, and we spent a couple days talking about the common house. But what was so fascinating to me is how myopic and intrigued people came around designing the world between the houses, if you will. So, I mean, it's just as if you were to take a street in any given neighborhood and remove the cars from the street and everybody park at the end of the street. That was more or less what they decided to do. They all parked in the alley. And so they talked about the amphitheater and the outdoor dining and the gardening and the outdoor workshop. And they wanted as many houses as possible to see the bicycle shed, so that when they decided to go for a bicycle ride, they could see who else was going, and maybe they want to go, maybe they don't want to go. The front porches, go ahead. And here it is built. Go ahead. And here's the common terrace. And more or less, I think you can see that when they talked about the life between the buildings and they described the life between the buildings, that they were actually able to pull it off. Go ahead. And so that they could see every morning at 10 a.m., whoever wants to go for a bicycle ride meets at the bicycle shed, for example, and as they were planning the houses, they said, okay, Chuck, make sure that as many houses as possible can see the bicycle shed, so that they can see who else is going. Go ahead. I haven't seen Margaret for a couple weeks. Maybe I'll go on a bicycle ride, for example. And I put a couple slides in here very similar to what we showed the urban design panel in Vancouver a few weeks ago, because a neighborhood center catalyzed around that project. Go ahead. And similarly to the site that we're looking at here in Vancouver on 33rd Street, we're hoping it has a very positive effect on Victoria Street. Go ahead. Which needs help. And in a town where, go ahead, Lauren, if you wouldn't mind. In a town which has a lot of wonderful neighborhood centers, there's just Victoria and 33rd, just doesn't happen to be one of them yet, but I think it will be someday. Go ahead. And another part of Victoria. So here happens to be the project that we're looking at on 33rd. Go ahead. And it's a fantastic group of people to work with. I just want to say that, by the way. They are just that big. I mean, very thoughtful, very giving, just like all the other co-housing projects here. We also work with the Yarrow group, and it's been really, really fun. Go ahead. There's something about the creativity of this is the alley now off of 33rd. Go back one. There's something. Go back one. This is what they're planning to accomplish. There's something about the creativity in Vancouver. There's about 15, 20 households we've been working with from the beginning that brings a neighborhood together. Go ahead to the next one. Where you never see anybody on this laneway now versus that last slide. I think we'll metamorphosize that laneway quite a bit. I mean, it's for garbage cans and garages. That's about it right now. Go ahead. And I hope you can see the intensity by which people get together and put their new neighborhood together. Even when it's on a fairly tight site, they can see it. They can see the potential. Go ahead. And this happens to be the scheme that we're working with. Go ahead. Very considerable number of green considerations. Go ahead. Inspired very much by the Windsong Co-housing community in Langley. Go ahead. Lots of discussion about natural light and natural ventilation and, making it work with the climate, etc. Go ahead. So that, for example, this happened to be my electric bill last year. It's my favorite slide, by the way. Because we have one solar panel, and it was enough because, go ahead, back one. because the natural light in our house, this happens to be our house, is such that you don't need the lights on during the day. It always drives me crazy walking to a house in the middle of the day, you have to turn the lights on. Go ahead. Go ahead, one more. But light and air, this happens to be our common house. Light and air is important, the architecture is important, I'm an architect, I think that's important. But go ahead, one more, thank you. But in the end of the day, if it doesn't work socially, why bother, is more or less our firm's mantra, if you have to have a mantra. If it doesn't work socially, why bother? In other words, I'm not interested, as an architect, I'm not interested in tearing down a bunch of trees and putting a bunch of, sticks and bricks together and making just another box, unless people feel like they can, know their neighbor, be supported by the neighbor, care about their neighbor in a meaningful way. Go ahead. Where the kids can hang out and be kids and have a great time and build things and learn how to work together. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if that was the only legacy of co-housing, that means a lot to me. And I've seen it because I've seen it over and over again. I've seen these kids grow up in co-housing who know how to put a proposal on the table, know how to make an argument with other kids about why this is the best thing to do, and know how to take that into their adult lives in a very convivial and productive way. My daughter, who grew up in co-housing, she now works for the United Nations in New York. We were just visiting her last week, and it's been quite something. Don't get me started about my daughter, okay? She grew up in co-housing, and she went off to college down in Occidental in Los Angeles, a very political school, very politicized school. It's where Obama went to school, so there's a lot of politics there, and they specialize in politics, if you will. And when Jesse called me 2 weeks after becoming a freshman in college and said, "Dad, I'm running for the school senate, and by the way, I'm running against 6 other kids," I said, all I could say to myself was, I sure feel sorry for those other kids. Because Jesse had them all wearing, vote for me t-shirts within the first, half the kids on the campus, within the first 2 weeks, that they paid for by the way. And anyway, because she grew up in co-housing where cooperation was the norm and she knew how to, help get people mobilized. Go ahead. Thanks very much, and I hope that's a good overview of co-housing, and please feel free to ask whatever questions you are interested in, and I know that the different groups are going to do a quick presentation about their projects as well. So thanks a lot. Any questions about co-housing in general? Sir. And if there's specific ones about specific projects, I'll just wait till they come up, but go ahead.
I'm kind of interested in the form of ownership that takes place. Is it a strata, is it a co-op, or is it each individual freehold?
Typically it's strata. As implemented in the U.S., there's about 120 projects now finished in the U.S., and all but 2 of them are strata. Well, actually there's 2 co-ops and 1 all rental, but the rest of them are strata, or condominiums, yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, the question is are they typically strata? And the answer is all but 3 of them now in the U.S. out of 120. Yeah. And it's mostly because, the co-housers aren't interested in inventing any new real estate propositions or anything. It's pretty much whatever the path of least resistance is, and typically strata is that. And your follow-up question, sir?
And my follow-up question would be then, the turnover of a piece of property. People move, people have to move.
Right.
Do they freehold? How does that?
Well, they basically sell the co-housing typically on the free market, basically. Typically to somebody who's motivated to moving into co-housing. There's very little vetting process, if you will. I mean, like where I live, you have to cook dinner, right? So you have to cook dinner for your neighbors. I'm cooking dinner for 30 or 40 or sometimes 50 people, right? So if you don't want to live in co-housing, you wouldn't move there on purpose. But if you want to live in co-housing, it's a good way to go, to just buy in. Actually, it's always a possibility. Sir.
Yes. Could you give some comparison of the density on the floor space ratio level and a cost per square foot for most of these compared to commercial projects?
Yeah, the projects that I just showed, for example, those 5 or 6 projects, let's see, how do they compare? Well, on a square foot. It's actually quite difficult to compare them on a per square foot because, for example, I moved from an 1,800 square foot 2-story house with a full basement to an 1,100 square foot house that I paid more for, right, in co-housing community when I moved to the first co-housing in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's not that uncommon necessarily, but I had a 2,100 square foot common house, so in effect I had a 3,200 square foot house because the common house really was, and currently is in another project, a full extension of my house. My laundry is there, I eat dinners there, you know, the workshop is there, there's lots of things that are there. So depending if I counted against 1,100 square foot, it's usually a little bit more. If I count it against 3,200 square foot, of course, it's much less. The interesting thing I find with co-housers, though, is that they actually end up wanting to pay more, oddly enough. I mean, than what would be normally on the market. Because once the dialogue starts, like where I live, somebody said, hey, we're making all these new houses, why don't we use sustainably grown lumber, for example? Well, that costs about 15% more. Why don't we use solar panels? We have, all 34 houses have a solar panel. None of them had it previously, but we could get them for $8,000 a house instead of $15,000 a house that they would have cost for a single family house. So the economics are, you know, you start to see that these are good investments that the co-housing groups are interested in making. These are investments. Certainly if you fly from here to Calgary, which I have several times, you see that the clear-cut forests and you kind of go, well, maybe sustainably grown lumber is a better option than clear-cut lumber, for example. So people start to feel the desire to do the right thing and to make the investment. So, however, that said, the real savings that happens in co-housing, after interviewing about 200 people who live in co-housing, is what in your view is the real savings? They always say it's the lifestyle issues. In fact, I've got extraordinary numbers from people who've said, you know, that I used to have 2 cars, now I have 1 car. I used to have 1 car, now I have no cars. You know, lots of different ways of accomplishing, you know, savings long term. And then, sir, in front of him. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so in the seed process, when you're starting out a development, for example, using the one in the States that had 16 units,
right.
How many stakeholders committed do you need to get before you can start getting traction with zoning and financing, and how much kind of level of commitment do you need from the original seed people? Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, you know, what do I think is the smallest group you want to start with, basically, when you start a new co-housing community?
Some general information.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's an interesting question. I mean, a regular strata project, for example, will start with one person who has enough money. I mean, you could, a single person could obviously develop a real estate. But generally speaking, I believe it's worthwhile to start off with at least a half a dozen families. And we've actually done numerous site plans with a half a dozen or 24 families, and depending on the size of the co-housing community. Half a dozen families works out really well. Because you get a well-rounded data, basically. My experience with using smaller numbers is you end up with kind of skewed data. And you know, for those of you who remember your probability and statistics classes in college, you know, you can't even make a bell curve without 6 samples. 6 samples is the minimum. You can't have a standard deviation without 6 samples. For example, 6 is the minimum. So it's funny, it's really worked out for me. My own personal experience has been really true empirically as well. When we've tried to do a couple projects when starting out with just like 4 or 5 families, and you could tell that whether it was too much personality or whatever, it was getting skewed one way or the other. And then you get above 6 households, 7, 8, 9, 10. That said, you know, I don't really have a top limit. I mean, we've done projects with 26 households. That one I mentioned was Christian in the wheelchair. We started with 26 households from day one. It was no more complicated. Frankly, I found that project to be a lot easier than the project we started with 6 or 10 households. Because when you have 26 households, 35 people in every design meeting, for example, or more, you know, basically all the good ideas come to the table all at once, whether you're ready for them or not, and you have to sort of amalgamate them into a single direction that we're all headed in, and any eccentric person, you know, any eccentric opinions pretty much get pretty rounded out right away. So my experience is that's not a complication. You know, just to extend on that myself, I find you know, and the Danes say, don't try to do a co-housing with more than 50 adults. And that I've also learned to be true. You know, 50 they put the limit on, don't try to get consensus with more than 50 adults, for example. That kind of makes sense empirically. But there's lots of reasons for it, and I believe that's true. And equally important on the numbers side, I find that doing a project with less than 12 households is you know, it's not as good as more. Yeah.
Is there concern about the white middle class ghetto?
Oh, yes. I mean, in general, there is. You know, and a lot of groups that we've worked with, it's too bad I didn't show you some slides of the Cambridge co-housing, for example, or Emeryville co-housing, which there's one photo I have of Emeryville co-housing. There's 20 people in the slide, and not one of them were actually born in the U.S. But, and so in the case when they're urban, in the US anyway, they tend to be more mixed. But even that said, you know, it's an interesting question about, you know, where do we start? And in a way we need to start with ourselves. In a way, I happen to be white, and I happen to want to start with myself, and when it comes to making a neighborhood that works for me and a neighborhood that works for the broader community as well. And maybe other people will be interested and maybe they won't, but I'm not interested personally in telling other people that they should do it, for example, because I'm doing it. And hopefully other people will be motivated as well. We'll find out. Sir?
A lot of the co-housing communities that I've kind of seen have been mostly single-story and two-story developments, a little bit more spread out. I was kind of wondering what your take on major issues behind urban co-housing might be.
Well, I think it's very doable. And, oh yeah, what do I think about urban co-housing? You know, high-rise is challenging though. I mean, generally speaking, we grew up on the Serengeti Plains. We relate to each other very well horizontally, and it does very odd to stand here and try to talk to Lauren vertically. And it's very difficult to relate to people vertically, and it's very easy to relate to them horizontally. So you end up, one way or another, having to set up some kind of a horizontal setting so that people can relate to each other horizontally, whether it's the common house, and try to use maybe a couple of floors, but not. You can find examples in Europe. You can find a 10-story co-housing community, for example. One with 10 stories, the common house on the 4th floor, and every other floor has 4 units on it, for example. But they would be the first to argue it's not ideal. So there's ideal and there's what you can get away with, and you know what you can try to make work, basically. Yeah. Oh wow, there's a lot of hands. Sir, in the back.
I'm curious as an architect, when you take on a project like this, you have say 20 households. How do you manage the issue of when you design 3 or 4 prototypes, or you design 20 different houses, and how do you deal with that?
That's a great question, because we just dealt with it. Thank you. We just dealt with it here in Vancouver. How do you, if you have 20, 25 households, for example, how do you manage to design 3 or 4 households versus 25 different kinds of, or 3 or 4 houses versus 25 different houses? And I assume you recognize the fact that, of course, if you look at a typical strata, they're going to try to design as few different types of houses as possible, because that's what makes it economical. So what I find works out with co-housing groups, I mean, it's one of the things I really love about working with these groups, is you just put it all on the table. Here's the deal. If we design 3 or 4 different households that we can fit all 25 of you into, then your houses are going to cost this much. If we make 5 households instead of 4, they're going to go up by 5% or 10%. If we make 6 house types to accommodate every eccentric difference between all of you, it'll go up 10% or whatever. And you put it all on the table, and what I'm so amazed by is how disciplined they get. Oh, wait a minute, that's one more house type, let's not do that. Let's figure out some way that, because what happens is you get all these people to the table, and they get to know each other, and they're all motivated to keep everybody else in the deal, basically. They're all motivated to figure out a way to make it affordable to everybody who's here now. Everybody that's here, we're going to try to make it affordable for. And sometimes that takes a lot of creativity, for sure. I mean, actually, always it takes a lot of creativity. But everybody starts to see the discipline that we have to employ to get there, to get anywhere close to there. So not only different, few unit types, few building types, few eccentricities as possible until we get it built, for example, and then people modify their houses accordingly. But basically trying to set it up so that it's production versus custom. So in other words, it's something that a developer might do, although you don't recognize anything there. It's not necessarily so nouveau that the builders look at it and say, oh, I don't know what to do with this. I mean, it has to be something that they can just knock out and make it successful. So again, discipline and creativity, frankly, that's the only answer. And putting it all on the table and getting the group to help you figure it out. So I'll take a couple more questions. I know that the different co-housing groups want to jump up on the table. Ma'am.
Have any of these communities...
This ma'am first. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. And then get back.
Have any of these...
Go ahead first. Go ahead.
Have any of these communities matured?
Matured?
So that kids are gone and people
Yeah.
are there, and like has it been going on long enough that there's been a change? Experience that kind of a cycle?
Well, I was just last summer in Denmark visiting a project. Oh, the question is, have the communities matured? Or how have they matured? In Skråplanet, a co-housing community in Denmark of 33 houses, they were one of the first, the second, built in 1972, so 40 years now. And I was there last summer, and 22 of the original 33 families still live there, which is significant. That's consequential. And especially when you think about, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, the average household lasts 7 years before they move. I mean, they move every 7 years typically. And thank you, 1 minute I have. But what happens once you've created a neighborhood like this? You're pretty motivated to hang in there. Instead of, you might change your job before you change your neighborhood in this setting, for example. And anyway, they are currently retrofitting their community with grab bars and railings everywhere, and more ramps and fewer stairs. It's kind of their mantra. More ramps, fewer stairs. Yeah. So yeah, they're maturing. I mean, and some of them are dying, actually. So there was, yeah, you in the back.
What are some ways to make co-housing more accessible across the spectrum of income as well as people in a variety of life stages? I'm single, and I get married later, I might have some kids. What if someone wants to rent? What if someone wants to be broke? What's the stage there?
Yeah, the variety, how to handle the variety of circumstances and getting into co-housing. Lauren's telling me that's it. No, let me answer this last one, okay? Yeah, basically, I mean, I would answer that question like I would answer a lot of questions, which is the best way to see, for example, your circumstances get accomplished is that you would be involved in a co-housing community. I mean, I think the youngest person in Vancouver is 29. Britta, otherwise
23.
23? Really? Oh, Jubilee's only 23. Okay. That's pretty rare, actually. The 20-year-olds are about as in transition as you're going to find in the I have found. And usually it's younger families, but not that young necessarily. Jubilee's a new mother. Julie. Oh, not Jubilee. Oh, okay. So anyway, 23. And so anyway, the best way I can answer that was simply be involved with the co-housing community. And of course it might be complicated, if not impossible, to actually end up owning a unit. But I've been impressed, like where I live, how many people have gotten into the co-housing by renting a house there and stabilizing their life for a period of time, getting a good job, etc., growing their career. And usually a lot of that happens through connections that they end up getting in the co-housing. And then when a unit comes up for sale, this is actually what, when Kate and I moved into the Emeryville co-housing, somebody actually discounted their unit when they left, and we ended up buying their unit from them because they wanted to make it something that we could afford. And I have to stop now, so the only answer I have is to get involved. Thank you guys a lot.